In the late 13th century, the Venetian Arsenal began constructing a ship unlike any the Mediterranean had ever seen. The keel alone consumed 100 oak trees from the Dalmatian coast. Over 600 craftsmen worked for months shaping the hull, rigging the masts, and fitting 200 oars. This was a supergalley, longer and faster than any merchant vessel, armed with ballistae and 100 crossbowmen. The cost amounted to thousands of ducats, a significant fraction of Venice's annual budget. Venice built it not for conquest, but because Genoa had just launched its own superfleet. This was the opening move in a naval arms race that would transform shipbuilding, economics, and warfare. To sustain this competition, Venice created the first state-run industrial complex, the Arsenal, a sprawling shipyard capable of mass-producing galleys with unprecedented efficiency. They also pioneered the use of crossbowmen at sea, a cheap, deadly innovation that gave their ships a decisive edge, but the arms race carried an immense price. As both cities poured fortunes into bigger and more advanced fleets, the survival of each republic hung on outspending the other. What drove these cities to such extremes, and once started, could this cycle ever be broken? Medieval Venice, Genoa, Florence, Siena, and a dozen others were not just large towns, they were sovereign republics controlling their own hinterlands, trade routes, and armies. Their independence came from a power vacuum. The Holy Roman Empire was too weak to dominate Italy, the papacy too distracted, and no single feudal lord could subdue the entire peninsula. This fragmentation gave each city the freedom to act like a small empire, but it also made them competitors for limited resources, especially the lucrative trade routes that carried spices, wool, and silks. The commercial revolution of the 11th and 12th centuries flooded these cities with unprecedented wealth. Bankers, merchants, and guildmasters became the ruling class. They poured that wealth into fortifications, fleets, and mercenaries, not just for security but for prestige. Civic identity ran deep. A city's honor was measured by its cathedral, its walls, and its ability to dominate a rival. So when one republic launched a supergalley, another had to match it, not because they wanted war, but because falling behind meant losing trade, influence, and ultimately their freedom. The root of it all was money, not just wealth in the abstract, but direct control over specific trade routes that could make or break a city. Venice, for example, had secured a near monopoly on Byzantine trade through treaties dating back to the late 11th century. Spices, silks, and luxury goods flowed through Venetian ships, and the profits funded the arsenal, the galleys, and the banks. Genoa, locked out of that easy pipeline, looked elsewhere. They established colonies in the Black Sea, at Caffa and Trebizond, tapping into the Silk Road's western terminus and the grain trade from Crimea. Each outpost had to be fortified, defended, and linked to Genoa by a fleet that could match Venice's. So a duel over trade routes became a duel over armed ships, but the competition didn't always mean direct battle. Cities often fought proxy wars, funding one mercenary company or another to raid a rival's caravan or blockade a port. When Florence expanded into Tuscany, its wealth came from banking and wool, but that wealth paid for armies that could seize the passes controlling the wool trade from England and Flanders. You see the same pattern in the Low Countries, Bruges vs. Ghent over the cloth trade, each buying loyalty with gold and building walls to protect the source of that gold. Here's the complication. These economic pressures created a feedback loop that only tightened. The more a city invested in military power to protect its trade, the more it threatened its neighbor, forcing the neighbor to invest too. Each escalation felt defensive to the participant, but looked aggressive to the rival. And in a system with no external referee, that spiral had only one natural stopping point: financial collapse or conquest. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade ended with the sack of Constantinople. Venetian ships carried the Crusaders, and Venice dictated the plunder. Genoa watched from outside as Venice seized a monopoly on Byzantine trade, controlling the Bosporus and the richest ports of the eastern Mediterranean. By the mid-13th century, the competition focused on Crusader strongholds like Acre, where Venetian and Genoese merchants operated side by side, but with armed escorts and fortified warehouses. In 1256, a dispute over a monastery triggered the War of St. Sabas, fought by hired ships and local militias. Genoa allied with the Knights Hospitaller, Venice with the Templars. The fighting spread to sea, and both cities began converting merchant galleys into vessels designed for battle. Faster, more maneuverable, with raised platforms for archers and space for grappling hooks and rams. The real turning point came in 1298 off the coast of Curzola in the Adriatic. Venetian Admiral Andrea Dandolo commanded a fleet of nearly 100 galleys against Genoese Admiral Lambadoria. The battle lasted a full day. Genoa used a new tactic, refusing to engage directly until the Venetian galleys had tired themselves rowing against the current. When the Genoese finally struck, they shattered the Venetian line. The result was a heavy defeat. Over 7,000 Venetians were lost or captured. Among the prisoners was a merchant named Marco Polo, who used his time in a Genoese prison to dictate his travels. The battle was a shock. Both sides had invested heavily in warships, but Curzola proved that having more ships was not enough. The arms race had spawned an arms race in tactics, and neither side could stop the cycle of one-upmanship. Naval warfare had become a specialized and deadly profession, funded by the very trade it was meant to protect. The practical consequence of Curzola was not defeat for Venice, but a fundamental rethinking of how to build and deploy naval power. The Venetian Arsenal, already a state-run shipyard, underwent a dramatic expansion in the years after 1298. By the early 1300s, it had become the largest industrial complex in Europe, employing thousands of skilled workers who could assemble a galley from prefabricated parts in a single day. The arsenal pioneered something close to assembly line production, with standardized components that allowed ships to be repaired or built faster than any rival. Genoa responded by pushing its own shipwrights to design larger hulls and more efficient sail plans. The Genoese Great Galley, a merchant vessel that could carry cargo and fight, became a standard type, but Venice soon introduced the Supergalley, a longer, narrower version with 3 banks of oars per side in some accounts, reviving the ancient quadrium or quinquereme concept. These were not just larger, they carried heavier timber, reinforced rams, and raised fighting platforms that allowed more troops to board enemy ships. By the late 14th century, the arms race reached the gunpowder stage. Both cities began mounting small wrought iron cannons on the prows of their galleys, transforming ship-to-ship combat from a boarding affair into a ranged engagement. The first recorded naval use of cannon in the Mediterranean was in a Genoese-Venetian skirmish in the 1380s. Once one side had artillery, the other had no choice but to follow. The practical consequence of all this innovation was a sharp increase in cost and complexity. A supergalley cost about twice as much as a standard war galley and required a larger crew, more skilled oarsmen, and specialized artillery crews. The arsenal could build them fast, but the city could not afford to build indefinitely. The upward spiral had shifted from just quantity of ships to quality of ships, and that made the competition even more expensive and relentless. That spiral culminated in the War of Chioggia from 1378 to 1381, and it nearly destroyed Venice. The Genoese understood they could not defeat Venice in a straight naval contest. So they formed a coalition with Padua and Hungary, which controlled the Dalmatian coast. The plan was to strangle Venice from two directions. The Hungarians would cut overland trade routes, the Paduans would attack from the west, and the Genoese fleet would blockade the Adriatic. If it worked, Venice would be starved without ever fighting a decisive battle at sea. The trap nearly closed. In August 1379, the Genoese and their allies captured Chioggia at the southern end of the Venetian lagoon, giving them a harbor inside the lagoon itself. The Venetian fleet was bottled up, and the city's food supplies were dangerously low. Venice's leaders ordered every available vessel in the arsenal completed no matter the cost. Chroniclers record that the city stripped for timber, working day and night, and launched a new fleet in months. This was the payoff of earlier investments. The arsenal could produce galleys faster than any rival, but only because decades of racing had built that capacity. The counter-siege of Chioggia became the turning point. The Venetian fleet blocked the harbor entrance with hulks and chains, trapping the Genoese inside. Then Venetian sailors dragged small boats over the sandbars to attack from the land side. The Genoese were isolated, cut off from reinforcements, and forced to surrender in June 1380. In the closing act, off Anzio in 1381, a Venetian squadron caught a Genoese convoy carrying a relief fleet for Chioggia and destroyed it. Genoa had emptied its treasury and shipyards for that last effort. When the peace treaty was signed later that year, Genoa had lost not only the war but its will to compete as a first-rank naval power. The arms race culminated in a single war that broke one of the two contenders. Venice emerged dominant, but the cost had been enormous. The treasury was drained, trade disrupted, and thousands of citizens had perished. The race delivered its winner, but not a clean victory. It had exhausted both cities. Genoa never recovered its naval ambition. The republic that had once challenged Venice from the Black Sea to the Atlantic shrank into a second-rank power, increasingly torn by internal faction fights between noble families. The cost of the war had shattered its credit, and within decades Genoa fell under the sway of first Milan, then France. Its great shipyards fell silent, and its merchant fleet never again matched Venetian tonnage. Venice had won, but the victory felt hollow. The treasury was empty. The state had borrowed so heavily that forced loans became a permanent feature of civic life. The arsenal remained busy, but now it built fewer warships and more trading galleys. The Serene Republic controlled the eastern Mediterranean, yet the price of that dominance was a perpetual readiness for the next race. The question that hung over the Italian peninsula was simple. Would other cities learn from this lesson or repeat the pattern? In Tuscany, two rivals were already building their own escalation, not on the sea but on the land. The Tuscan rivalry began with a road, the Via Francigena, the main pilgrim and trade route from northern Europe to Rome, passed between Florence and Siena. Controlling the stretch through the Arno Valley meant tolls, markets, and regional leverage. Florence, the rising banking and wool center, wanted that control. Siena, older and fiercely independent, was determined to keep it. The first major clash came in September 1260 near Montepati. Siena, backed by the imperial Ghibelline faction, assembled an army that included German mercenaries and defeated Florence's larger force. Florence suffered thousands of casualties. The defeat humiliated the city and deepened the rivalry for generations. It also taught a hard lesson. Feudal levies and civic militias were not enough. The rivalry carried a political dimension. Florence was pro-papal Guelph, Siena pro-imperial Ghibelline. To win the next war, you needed professionals who fought for pay. So the arms race shifted from sea to land. Florence started hiring condottieri, mercenary captains with their own companies of armored cavalry and trained infantry. Siena responded in kind. Both cities poured silver into hiring the best soldiers. The result was a new kind of conflict, not a single decisive battle but an endless cycle of raids, sieges, and countermarches. Each city built taller walls, deeper ditches, and stronger towers. The landscape of Tuscany became a chessboard of fortified hill towns, each garrisoned by men whose loyalty lasted only as long as the payment. And the real discovery was that this system made war permanent. There was no peace, only a heavily armed pause. That pause was anything but idle. Both cities spent the lulls tearing down old walls and raising new ones, each circuit higher, thicker, and more expensive than before. Siena, still riding its victory at Montepatti, began a colossal expansion of its walls in the late 13th century. The new stone circuit snaked over the hills, enclosing far more territory and studding the skyline with fortified gates. At the heart of this effort rose the Torre del Mangia, a brick tower over 90 meters high. It was part bell tower, part watch post, part declaration of reach. Florence answered. The humiliation of Montepatti had made clear that its old walls were laughably inadequate. Between the late 13th and early 14th centuries, Florence built a third wall circuit, the largest of any Italian city at the time. It wrapped around an area 8 times larger than the old city, and at the center, the Palazzo Vecchio punched its own tower into the sky, nearly as high as Siena's. The message was identical, just backed by more Florentine gold. The race did not stop at city walls. Inside the gates, noble families competed to raise private towers. Bologna bristled with over 100 such structures, some over 60 meters tall. San Gimignano became a dense cluster of competing family towers, 14 of which still stand. These towers were not just status symbols, they were miniature fortresses stocked with supplies and defensive equipment, ready to turn a street into a fortified strongpoint. The urban landscape itself became part of the defensive system. The practical consequence was staggering. Every new wall or tower demanded years of labor, entire forests of timber for scaffolding, and stone quarried at ruinous expense. Sieges became long, grinding affairs because direct attack was nearly impossible against such defenses. The race in stone forced each city to pour ever more wealth into passive protection, locking the rivalry into a cycle that no one could afford to break. The towers rose, the walls grew, and the peace stayed heavily armed. But walls could not fight back. For that, cities needed armies, and armies in the Italian city-state world meant mercenaries. By the late 13th century, the old feudal levy of local knights had become nearly useless. Citizen militias were unreliable for long campaigns far from home, and they had a nasty habit of refusing to fight against fellow townsmen. So cities turned to professional soldiers for hire. These were the Condottieri, derived from the word condot, a meaning contract, and soon hiring the best captain became just another front in the arms race. A few names stood out. John Hawkwood, an English archer who fought in the 100 Years' War, arrived in Italy around the 1360s and became one of the most sought-after commanders in the peninsula. He worked for Pisa, then Florence, then Milan, and back again. His price rose with every switch. Similarly, Muzio Sforza built a personal army so feared that cities would pay whatever it took to secure his banner. The Sforza name came to represent military power independent of any single city, and that was the complication, because the Condottieri system was a market. Cities openly bid for the services of the most famous captains, driving up costs. Florence and Siena, Venice and Milan all competed for the same handful of commanders. The arms race was no longer just about ships or walls. It was about who could afford the most expensive fighter, and those fighters quickly learned that their value came from not ending the war too decisively. A general who crushed an enemy completely might put himself out of work, so battles became careful, formal affairs, often ending with few casualties and a negotiated ransom for prisoners. The system was efficient for the mercenaries. For the cities, it was a hemorrhage of gold that bought only temporary, conditional loyalty. While Florence and Siena haggled over mercenary contracts, a new threat was assembling in the north. Milan, under the Visconti family, had no intention of playing the same careful, negotiated game. Gian Galeazzo Visconti, who took power in the late 1370s, saw the arms race not as a way to defend trade but as a tool for conquest. He systematically absorbed neighboring towns, Verona, Vicenza, Padua, and even the once mighty Siena for a time, by sheer military force. Milan became the first Italian city-state to act like a territorial power, building an army that could fight year after year, not just for one campaign. To do this, the Visconti poured money into field artillery, a curiosity that became decisive. By the 1390s, Milanese engineers were casting bombards that could batter down walls faster than any siege tower or miner. These early cannons were crude, unreliable, and dangerous to their crews, but they changed the calculus of war. A city that once relied on thick walls now had to face artillery that could reduce those same walls to rubble in days. The arms race was no longer about who could build the highest tower or the fastest galley. It was about who could melt the most bronze into a barrel that could throw a stone ball through stone. The response from the other Italian powers was not to match Milan in isolation but to form coalitions. Florence, Venice, and a shifting roster of smaller cities created anti-Visconti leagues, pooling their resources to hire larger mercenary armies and field their own artillery. This was not the old bilateral rivalry. Now the entire peninsula was dividing into two armed camps. The siege of Brescia in 1401, where Milan tried to take a city defended by a combined Florentine-Venetian force, became a grinding contest of artillery, starvation, and countermining. The cost of that single siege was greater than many entire wars from a century earlier. Milan had escalated the arms race from a contest between neighbors into a struggle for regional hegemony. And once the race had grown to encompass leagues and kingdoms, the old rules of limited wars and careful mercenary contracts began to break down. Could any city, even the richest, afford to stand alone against the Milanese juggernaut? The answer was no, and that realization triggered the Gunpowder Revolution, the most destructive phase of the Italian arms race. By the 1430s, both sides understood that early cannons were not just siege breakers but weapons demanding a complete rethink of defense. At the Second Siege of Brescia in 1438, Venetian defenders faced Milanese bronze guns that fired stone balls weighing over 100 pounds. The defenders responded by thickening their walls with earthen ramparts and firing their own smaller cannons from the battlements. Neither side had an absolute advantage, but the cost of that single siege, the bronze, the powder, the labor, could have funded a year of normal military operations. Milan cast ever larger bombards, some requiring 30 oxen to drag into position. Venice, Florence, and their allies poured money into new fortifications. Walls that sloped inward to deflect impacts, lower and thicker profiles, and the first tentative angular bastions designed to eliminate blind spots. Military engineers like Francesco di Giorgio began traveling between cities, offering their services to whoever could pay. A city that did not upgrade its walls was a city that would be conquered within months. But upgrading meant debt, forced loans from the merchant class, and sacrificing civic projects like church construction or harbor improvements. The old model of the medieval wall, a high curtain with square towers, was dying. In its place came the Trace Italian, a star-shaped fortress designed to resist cannon fire and enable defensive firepower. This shift did not happen overnight. For decades, cities found themselves in an awkward transition, too much invested in old walls to tear them down but too vulnerable to keep them as they were. The practical consequence was that the arms race now demanded not just more ships or more mercenaries. but a constant, expensive technological upgrade cycle that favored the richest cities and bankrupted everyone else. Venice relied on forced loans called prestanza to fund the arsenal's endless galley production. When the government demanded money, wealthy citizens had to lend, with repayment often delayed years and interest barely symbolic. This created a creditor class whose fortunes depended on the state's survival, their wealth mortgaged to the fleet. The system worked as long as Venice's wars were profitable, but it strained the merchant elite who bore the burden. Other cities adopted different fiscal mechanisms. Florence created the Monte, a public debt where citizens bought shares funded by taxes on salt, wine, and basic goods. The poor paid for the arms race without ever seeing a battlefield. Milan under the Visconti and Sforza imposed heavy taxes on land and every transaction, turning the duchy into a fiscal machine. The notorious machina tax on milling grain drove peasants to grind flour illegally. Each system had its breaking point. Venice's forced loans alienated merchants. Florence's debt created permanent fiscal drag. Milan's taxation impoverished the countryside and eroded the tax base over time. The arms race was a competition in fiscal extraction as much as in military hardware. The cities that could devise the most durable system of collecting wealth could outlast rivals, but every system faced limits. The arms race demanded constant escalation, forcing each city to transform itself into a financial engine capable of sustaining endless expansion. That transformation came at immense cost to the society that fueled it. These fiscal systems restructured daily life. In Florence, the compulsory militia called the ordinands required every able-bodied man to train and serve in the city's defense, pulling them from their trades for days or weeks at a time. Marching drills filled the streets. Bell towers were used as lookout posts with citizens rotating observation duty. Venice's arsenal demanded constant skilled labor, and workers were often conscripted for extended shifts during wartime, disrupting families and local economies. Public works for defense also reshaped the landscape, intruding on private lives. Walls expanded, swallowing suburbs and forcing relocations. Streets were widened for troop movement, sometimes demolishing entire neighborhoods. In Siena, the massive wall-building projects of the 13th and 14th centuries required years of labor and materials, with citizens forced to contribute either money or manual work. The cult of the Condottieri added another layer. Victorious mercenary captains received triumphal entries, statues, and public pensions. Their faces appeared on coins and frescoes. This glorification made military values central to civic identity, pushing young men toward soldiering as a path to glory and ensuring a steady supply of recruits for the next campaign. But the deepest social wounds were internal. The constant demand for resources and labor exacerbated class tensions. The ruling elites who controlled the arms race often lived in walled palaces, while the poor bore the brunt of conscription and taxation. The Ciompi revolt was the most dramatic explosion of that simmering resentment. When the costs of competition came home, the lines between citizen and soldier, home and barracks, blurred, creating new tensions no new wall or tax could resolve. When two cities spent everything on armies and fortifications, the natural next step was finding allies to share the burden. The arms race stopped being a private rivalry and became a system of shifting coalitions that entangled half of Europe. Italy became a laboratory of diplomatic experimentation where every war produced a new league. The League of Venice in 1454 brought Florence, Venice, and smaller cities together specifically to counter Milan's land-based juggernaut. But these alliances were never stable. A city that fought with you yesterday might sign a separate truce tomorrow if the price was right. The papacy played a double game, sometimes mediating, sometimes exploiting the chaos to reclaim territories. Every new alliance brought new obligations. Florence might call on Milan one year and fight against it the next. Condottieri, who led these wars, often switched sides when a better contract appeared, turning battles into elaborate negotiations in armor. The complexity bred a new profession, the resident ambassador. Cities began stationing permanent diplomats in each other's capitals, watching for shifts in alliance, reporting on military preparations, and trying to buy loyalty before the enemy did. The result was an arms race without clear boundaries. A war between Florence and Siena could draw in Milan, Venice, the papacy, and eventually France. Each new participant brought its own arsenal, debts, and reasons to keep fighting. The system became self-sustaining, but when every alliance came with a price and every victory sowed the seeds of the next war, how long could the balance hold? By the mid-15th century, any conflict risked pulling half of Italy into the war. The Milan-Venice struggle from 1452 to 1454 proved the point. Francesco Sforza, the new Duke of Milan, was a celebrated condottiero. Venice, still recovering from its war with Genoa, saw a chance to stop Milanese expansion. Both sides spent heavily on mercenaries and traded sieges across Lombardy. Neither could land a knockout blow. The stalemate left both treasuries empty and both populations exhausted. Then, on April 9, 1454, in the town of Lodi, representatives of Milan and Venice signed a treaty that did more than end the war. It established mutual recognition of territory and a commitment to resolve disputes diplomatically. This Peace of Lodi became the foundation of the Italian League, a collective security pact including Milan, Venice, Florence, the Papal States, and Naples. For the first time in decades, the major Italian powers agreed to maintain existing borders and present a united front against outside aggressors. The arms race did not stop. Venice kept its arsenals running, Florence maintained its fortifications, Milan continued casting cannon, but the competition shifted. Instead of pouring wealth into armies, cities competed on culture. Patronage of artists, construction of cathedrals and palaces, sponsorship of scholarship became the new battlefield. The Renaissance flourished because the military arms race was temporarily capped by a diplomatic one. The Peace of Lodi gave Italy 40 years of relative peace, but that peace rested on a paradox. The balance of power that kept the city-states from destroying each other also made them richer, more stable, and more tempting to the emerging national monarchies beyond the Alps. By the late 1480s, the treaty's architecture began to crack. The arms race had not returned. Something far worse had taken its place. The French invasion of Italy in 1494 shattered that fragile peace. Charles Roman VIII of France brought an army unlike anything the city-states had faced. It was not just numbers. His heavy bronze artillery could reduce a medieval wall to rubble in hours. The Italian League collapsed almost immediately. Florence surrendered without a real fight. The Pope submitted. City-states that had spent generations racing to outbuild each other now raced just to survive. But the rules had changed. This was no longer a competition between Venice and Milan or Florence and Siena. The arms race had leaped to a continental scale. France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire now competed over Italy's territories. They used Italy's own innovations against its cities. The Venetian Arsenal still built galleys, but now they served a republic scrambling to preserve its independence against a Spanish empire that could outspend any single city-state 20 times over. The Condottieri, who had once sold their swords to the highest bidder among the cities, now signed contracts with kings. The fortifications that Florence and Siena had perfected, the thick walls and angled bastions, became standard equipment for the new territorial states. The medieval city-state arms race did not end because the cities chose peace. It ended because the race itself outgrew them. The very success of their competition, the arsenals, the professional armies, the advanced artillery, made them too valuable to ignore and too small to resist. From 1494 onward, Italy became a battlefield for foreign powers, the autonomous city that could set its own military policy, that could decide its own level of armament, that could escalate a rivalry into an arms race. That kind of city effectively vanished. The arms race continued, but the runners were no longer the cities. They had become the ground beneath the runners' feet. Though the cities vanished as independent drivers, the hardware and methods they perfected did not. The Venetian Arsenal, the most advanced industrial facility in Europe capable of assembling a galley in a single day, became a model for state-run standardized production that drew the attention of kings. France built its own shipyards along the Atlantic, copying the Arsenal's assembly line logic. Spain's royal dockyards at Barcelona and Seville adopted Venetian techniques for hull design and rigging. The Arsenal became the template for what we now call a military-industrial complex, a term with roots in medieval Venice. The Condottieri captains who once auctioned their swords to the highest-bidding city found themselves commanding royal armies. Giovanni de' Medici's famous black bands fought for the Pope and the Empire. Francesco Ferrucci's tactics were studied by French marshals, the professional contract armies born from competition among Florence, Milan, and Venice became the standard for emerging nation-states. Artillery and fortifications traveled fastest. The angled bastions and thick walls of the Trace Italian, which defended Siena and Florence, were copied across Europe from the Netherlands to the Ottoman frontiers. The new gunpowder ordnance developed in the arms race, bombards and field cannon, became indispensable equipment for any aspiring great power. So when the French King Charles Roman VIII invaded Italy in 1494, he brought not just his own army, but the very tools that Italian city-states had perfected against each other. The arms race had trained an entire continent. Beyond Italy, the same competitive dynamics played out in the northern trading cities, though with different hardware and endings. The Hanseatic League was a confederation of merchant cities, but internally Lübeck fought an economic war with inland Brunswick, which tried to break Lübeck's control over trade routes. Lübeck imposed a trade blockade and built more cogs armed with crossbowmen to force Brunswick into submission. On the eastern edge, Danzig spent decades in a naval arms race against the Teutonic Knights, building warships that could carry bombards to protect its grain trade. The Hanseatic cities rarely fought pitched naval battles. They used economic pressure backed by credible force, but spending on ships, fortifications, and mercenaries followed the same upward spiral, driven by the same logic. If your neighbor builds one warship, you build two. In the cloth-weaving cities of Flanders, Ghent and Bruges struggled for primacy over the wool trade with England. The arms race there was less about navies and more about urban militias. Ghent turned its guilds into a citizen army, arming weavers with crossbows, pikes, and handguns. When Bruges asserted dominance, Ghent's guild militia marched out and defeated them. The Count of Flanders responded by fortifying his castles and hiring professional troops from France. The Flemish cities could not sustain this forever. Their wealth came from textiles, and constant drilling and taxation sparked revolts among the workers. Unlike Italy, where no strong central power existed, northern arms races were often cut short by kings. The Duke of Burgundy, the King of France, or the Hanseatic Diet intervened to impose peace because the cities were too small to resist the emerging territorial state. The innovations, standardized shipbuilding, urban militia organization, early gunpowder tactics, were still absorbed into the machinery of the nation-state, just as in Italy. But the northern cities surrendered their independence earlier, and their arms race became a footnote in the rise of the Burgundian and French monarchies. And that pattern, a cycle where each city's perfectly reasonable security investment triggered the exact same response from its rival, is what political scientists call the security dilemma. You build walls because you fear attack. Your neighbor sees those walls and fears your intentions, so they build taller walls. Now you must thicken yours. Neither side wanted war, but the logic of self-preservation produced a spiral that made war more likely, not less. The medieval city-states lived this dilemma every generation. Venice and Genoa could not stop building galleys because stopping meant vulnerability. Florence and Siena could not stop fortifying because the other would seize the opening. And the tragedy is that this trap was invisible from inside. Each decision seemed prudent at the time. Only in hindsight could anyone see that the race itself was the enemy. We see similar dynamics today, not with crossbowmen and bombards, but with cities competing for Amazon headquarters, building stadiums, or racing to install the fastest fiber optic networks. The currency has changed, but the logic is the same. If San Jose grants tax breaks, Palo Alto must match them, and the public pays the price. The arms race becomes a transfer of wealth from citizens to the very entities the cities are trying to attract. And just like in medieval Italy, it takes an external shock, a recession, a merger, or a state government stepping in to break the cycle. There were exceptions. The Hanseatic Diet, the Lombard League, the Peace of Lodi. These were moments when cities chose cooperation over competitive buildup. But those moments required extraordinary statesmanship and a willingness to trust, a resource as scarce in the 14th century as it is today. The medieval arms race teaches us something uncomfortable. Competition that begins as a rational response to a real threat can become its own engine, one that no single participant can shut off. And that is a lesson that did not disappear when the last Venetian supergalley was dismantled. It is still being learned. The same competitive energy that drove cities to build larger war galleys, thicker walls, and more expensive armies also produced some of the greatest art and architecture in the West. The arms race did not just consume wealth. In ambitious republics, it also generated a cultural legacy that outlasted every canon and treaty. Consider Florence in the early 15th century. The city had poured enormous sums into fortifications, hired Condottieri, and financed decades of war against Siena and Milan. Yet when the time came to complete its cathedral, it did not scale back. It launched one of the most audacious engineering projects of the age, the Dome of Santa Maria del Fiore. Filippo Brunelleschi's self-supporting double-shell dome was not a direct military investment, but it was a direct product of the same competitive mentality. Florence needed a dome that would dwarf those of rival cities. The city fathers openly saw the cathedral as a statement of power, a stone and brick declaration that Florence was the true capital of Tuscany, funded by the same tax revenues and public loans that had paid for the army. Other cities played the same game. Siena built the Torre del Mangia and expanded its walls, not just for defense but for display. Venice rebuilt the Palazzo Ducale with its Gothic facade as the naval arms race with Genoa peaked, its grandeur announcing stability and wealth to every foreign ambassador. The arsenal, the industrial heart of that race, became a showcase itself, decorated with marble and lions. The practical consequence is that the arms race left behind more than battlefields and ruined budgets. It left cathedrals, squares, and towers that still define these skylines, deliberate investments in prestige, funded by the same competitive logic that built the war machines. Even a destructive cycle can produce enduring beauty. The medieval city-state arms race ended not through peace but through absorption by larger powers. Venice and Genoa bled each other white for a trade that eventually passed them by. Florence and Siena poured fortunes into walls and towers that could stop neither a plague nor a French army. The tragic irony is that the very wealth and independence that enabled these cities to compete also made them targets. They could not stop because stopping meant surrendering to a rival. Yet these rivalries left more than exhausted treasuries. They produced the arsenal's innovations in mass production, the condottieri system that evolved into the early modern officer corps, and fortification designs that shaped warfare for centuries. They left cathedrals and towers that still define skylines, a legacy of competitive escalation turned into enduring beauty. Which medieval city's arms race do you think had the most lasting impact on warfare? Venice's naval innovations or Florence's fortifications? Subscribe for more deep dives into how competition has shaped history, from ancient empires to modern superpowers.